All right, here we go. Welcome to Best Practices for Web Content. We'll be talking about things like writing for the web, plain language, how people read online, and just a whole host of other best practices for those of you that are building pages and generating content for the web, whether that is public web or intranet. So let's go ahead and get started and talk about how we can improve our content itself. And that starts with writing for the web. And when you are writing content for the web, before you write anything, you should really answer these three questions here. First, who is this for, right? How much do they know about your topic? Identify the gaps in their knowledge that you can fill in. And this also lets you know when it's okay to use and maybe not even need to explain certain technical terms. What do they want, right? What does your audience want? Are they looking for a fact? Are they trying to understand the subject or make a decision? Structure and format your content to help them meet that goal, whatever it might be. And thirdly, what do you want? Why are you writing this content? What impact do you want it to have on the reader? And what do you want them to do? So when you've answered those three questions, you'll be in a better position to draft and write your content that helps meet the goals that both your users and you have for that content. And as we write, it's important that we use plain language, not just because it's a good idea, but it's actually the law. On October 13th, 2010, the Plain Writing Act of 2010 was signed, and it requires federal agencies to use clear government communication that the public can understand and use. And so really, it's important to remember your content is not clear unless your users can find what they need, understand what they find, and then use what they find to meet their needs. So those are kind of the guidance and the criteria that define plain language. If your users can't do those things, then there's a good chance that your content isn't written and organized in a way that users are able to find and use it. And then I often get the question, well, what about, I'm writing for a scientific or a highly educated academic audience? Well, studies have shown that even highly educated online readers still want succinct information that's easy to scan, just like everybody else. So again, it goes back to knowing your audience, choosing the words that are familiar to that audience, using short sentences and paragraphs. Try to aim for a 10 to 12th grade reading level and no higher. And then follow the basic web formatting rules for readability, many of which we'll go over today. And try to remember, being direct and plain spoken is not talking down. It's clear communication. So again, despite the education level of your audience, plain language is still always the best way to go. So how do people read online? Well, honestly, they don't. They very rarely read, and they're far more likely to scan your page than read word for word. So if no one's going to read your content, how do you present the information to get that detailed information to your reader? Well, we do that through something called chunking. And chunking is breaking up content into small units of information. So for example, if I asked you to remember this string of numbers, do you think you could? Well, you might find it easier to remember this phone number if it's chunked. So now, instead of 11 numbers, you only need to memorize 4 chunks. So we want to break up web content in the same way. Human short-term memory is limited. So if you want your users to retain information, pack that information into meaningful chunks. But simply chunking your text isn't enough. You also need to support scanning by making it easier to quickly identify the main points of the chunks. And you can do this by including things like headlines that are informative, headlines and subheadlines, using things like bulleted lists and tables to simplify complex content, highlight specific keywords and phrases, write in the inverted pyramid style, which is to start with the conclusion. And for longer articles, consider featuring an explicit overview or a summary to help encourage users to continue to scroll. Now, as we write our headlines and subheadlines, it's important to remember our headlines need to tell readers something useful. So this headline, "Make better, faster decisions with data visualization," is too broad. It doesn't really tell the user what to expect. But if you contrast it with "Data visualization helps you detect and prevent fraud faster," that headline is far more useful. It is specific and really gives the reader additional information about what they're going to continue to see and read about should they continue to keep reading the content on the page. You should also front load your headings with strong keywords. So if we compare these two headlines, the first being "Behold the new technologies for creating 3D imagery." Well, it runs the risk of not being read because the key phrase, in this case, "creating 3D imagery," it's positioned at the end, and a user needs to read the entire headline to understand its meaning. Whereas the second one is better. "Creating 3D imagery gets easier with new technologies." Moving those keywords to the front makes the heading more scannable. People can read only the first few words and still understand what the article is about. Bulleted lists can also help attract attention. They support scanning by shortening our text and revealing relationships between items. So if we take a look at these two examples here, where the first one is written as a full sentence, where the second one has taken the last 4 items and put them into a bulleted list, we can see how that second version is easier to read and more likely to be read. And we don't need to worry that version 2 takes up more vertical screen space. Users don't mind scrolling if they feel that they get interesting information as their eye moves down the screen, right? So a website that is inviting and easier to understand and scan through the appropriate use of bulleted lists is far more likely to have users scroll than a website that is repelling users through large walls of text. When we use bulleted lists, there's a couple of key factors to keep in mind. Try to write the individual list items so that they are similar line lengths. Reserve numbered lists for instances where the items need to occur in a specific order, such as steps in a procedure, or when keeping count is important, such as a top 10 list. Try to avoid repeating the same word at the beginning of each list item. And always introduce a list with a descriptive sentence or phrase to help provide some context about what the list will contain. Keep your formatting consistent. So if the list items are sentences, capitalize the first word of every list item and use ending punctuation. If the list items are fragments, don't use end punctuation. And while the rules say that you're not required to capitalize the first word of every list item, it's recommended that you do because it does make scanning easier. And vertical lists are best used when you have 3 or more items that you're trying to attract attention to. Anything shorter than 3 is likely to be an overkill and likely would work better with that content embedded in a sentence. You should also really avoid embedding lists within lists as they become very difficult for users to follow. We talked about writing in the inverted pyramid style. This is where you start with the content that is the most you start content with the most important piece of information so that readers can get the main point regardless of how much they read. And if you have a longer article or page structure, you can consider summarizing that so that users will scroll if they are motivated to get the details behind what it is that you're writing. Another type of content that bears discussing are frequently asked questions. The chances of you writing the question in the way that your user thinks to ask it is nearly impossible. Frequently asked questions are very difficult to scan, and most users give up on using them when they're trying to find information about a particular subject. Users are going to look for those keyword phrases in headlines or menu titles, not frequently asked questions. Frequently asked questions on a subject as a link text does not give user confidence that they're going to find the information they're looking for when they're searching for content about a particular topic. So the agency has actually published a standard on frequently asked questions. I have the link here in the slide, which I will then also make available after the fact, but it discusses when and how to properly use frequently asked questions. Because there is a correct use of FAQs. The correct use of FAQs is supplementing your content, but not replacing it. Don't use FAQs to explain an entire process, right? Your other structured paragraph written page content should do that. If you do write FAQs, try to use real customer feedback. Don't assume that the questions that people will have. If you can, monitor things like customer calls and emails to help create those helpful FAQs. And make sure that the content you're providing in your FAQs is unique. When an FAQ has the same content as other web pages, it usually means that the FAQ content is redundant and it will easily become outdated, especially when content on the website is updated, but the FAQs are not. And again, you want to limit the volume of that FAQ content. When there are too many questions, searching through them can overwhelm the reader, and they may never find an answer to their question. So if you do have FAQs that you know you need to convert, you should do so by first reading through them all, then go through them and group them by topic and subject. Those topics or subjects may end up being separate basic pages, or they may end up being headlines or headers that you convert. In most cases, you can take the question and with a few simple word changes, you can convert that question to a heading. And you can do the same thing with the answer, where sometimes simply a few small word changes and the answer reads as if it's a paragraph on the page that supports and provides more detail that was described in the heading. So again, if you decide to create FAQs, or after pulling out the content that you want, you still have some remaining FAQs that you think make sense to leave in that format, read through them all again. With the remaining FAQs, you should also go through them and group them by topic and subject. And then develop headings for each of those sections and organize your FAQs in a way that makes sense to the reader. Read through each of the sections and edit the content as necessary. Focus on the steps in the process and think about what the reader is trying to accomplish. And again, eliminate redundancies. This can also help with organizing those FAQs. So now let's talk about creating accessible content, right? Many users, many of you have heard of the Section 508 accessibility requirements. And honestly, usability and accessibility often go hand in hand. And so when you're focused on certain accessibility factors, in many cases, those support better usability as well. And so what I've pulled out here and is also available on the accessibility website on the intranet, every EPA at Work page in the footer has accessibility as a link there that you can use. And within that area is this create accessible content. And I'm going to talk about 11 key accessibility factors, but these are spelled out in far more detail online, where you can read not only information about specifics about what these are and why they matter, but then also how to actually implement these specific tasks that may be necessary to make the content accessible. So I think most of us have heard of alternative text, right? We need to make sure that the alternative text describes an image and its meaning in context, right? Excuse me. So if, for example, it's not just enough to describe what the image is, you want to describe what the meaning of that image is in context with where it's placed on the page. If you are using an image and it's purely decorative, it has no additional support, then alt text is not required, but it's recommended that it either has an empty space or it is something on the back end that we're working on to make sure that things that are used on the intranet where the images are indeed only decorative, that they are tagged as being decorative so that screen readers know that and you as users don't need to do anything extra. So for those of you that have created content on the intranet, things like our media blocks or cards, or the image really is decorative only. We're looking at ways where we can tag those in that way. But certainly if your images do provide additional meaning, it's important that you use alternative text that is descriptive. Make sure that your headings are formatted as heading 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., right? Not just big, bold text. And in addition to making sure that they are formatted as those headers, they need to go in order. So on the intranet, all of our page titles are heading 1. So the next level heading that you would apply to text in your body field would be heading 2. And if that had a subheading, it would be heading 3. We can't jump from heading 2 to heading 4 just because we like the style differently, because it also, headings not only provide a look and feel, but they provide structure as well that a lot of assistive technologies use to make the content more accessible to other users. Make sure your lists are actually formatted as lists and are not just symbols and numbers. I see this happen a lot when you copy from Word and you paste it into the content management system. It doesn't always format the content as a list. It might just place the numbers as actual text, 1, 2, 3, or something that looks like a bullet but isn't. So make sure that if you have a list that you've copied into the body field, that it is actually formatted as a list. And if you're using tables, make sure they're using real header cells. So if that first row in your table is the header, highlighting the text and making it bold does not actually identify it as a header. Use the table properties that are available in the body field to actually identify specific cells or rows or columns as headers. And they will be structured that way, not just have the design elements applied, but actually structured. Color contrast is a requirement where we have a requirement to make color contrast strong enough for users with low vision or color blindness. And so there are different color contrast tools that are out there to help you identify if the background color, is a particular shade of blue and your text is white. How small can that text be while still having an appropriate level of color contrast? So again, making sure that your color contrast is strong enough is important for accessibility. Make sure your links are meaningful, meaning that they're self-explanatory even out of context. So not things like click here. And we'll talk a little bit more about writing good links in a little bit. It's important that you identify languages for screen readers. So if your site is in English and now you add the word Español and you don't use the language tag, a screen reader is going to read that as Espanol. So the body field, the toolbar in our content management system has a language tag. A button to apply a language tag so that if you are writing something in a different language, you can identify it as such. Try to really avoid using images of text. Even if you place alt text there, it's very unlikely that that image will render exactly as you expect it to, especially as we have folks with lots of different screen resolutions, screen sizes, and our sites are responsive, so they will respond to the size of the user's screen. Also, don't use layout tables to create fake columns, right? Tables are for data, not for layout. Both EPA at work and ORD at work, and I'm not sure about the public web, but definitely the intranet has a grid button that actually supports you creating maybe 2 columns of content if you want to control the layout. Use the grid styling capability, not tables. In your writing, you also want to avoid using things like sensory characteristics that would disappear when the layout or color perception changes. So for example, the red items in the right-hand column. First of all, if I'm colorblind, I may not be able to identify what is red. And if I'm on a smaller screen, the site may have responded and the information laid out differently so that there is no right column. So try to avoid language that includes those sensory characteristics. Also, do not use color alone to provide meaning. Again, if I can't distinguish between the colors based off of some type of vision impairment, It's important that I am able to identify something using something other than color. And so while those 11 accessibility factors are out there, right, they certainly are meant to, they're not everything, but those are some of the key ones that we find a lot. And on the intranet, we're using this tool called Editorially. What's nice is that it runs automatically, right? Which is, as long as you're logged in, it will always be running on the pages that you're viewing. And it works well in that way because it's always running, and it's one of those things that you don't have to turn on to get the information, or remember to turn on to get the information. It runs in context, which means it's going to focus exclusively on content issues, right? So the idea is things that page editors could easily understand and easily fix. Our intranet content management systems use a series of tools that can kind of put together the page using a lot of different complex scenarios, right? Different pieces of things are plugged together to build out and display the page to our users. So something like an accessibility checker that might run on an individual field may not be able to see errors that would appear when the page is actually rendered in the browser. So just remember that Editorially is meant to supplement, not replace, any other testing that you might do with comprehensive tools or other real assistive devices. But these three icons that you see on the screen here, there is the blue circle with the person. If you see that in the bottom right-hand corner, the tool has not found any accessibility issues. If you see the yellow question mark, it means there may be some accessibility issues and a manual check is required. And the red exclamation mark will tell you that there are definitive 508 violations that need to be addressed. And what I really like about this tool is it not only tells you what the problems are, but then also helps provide guidance on why and includes links on how to fix things. So we talked a little bit about better links, right? Or links, the way that you write links being important in how your content is both accessible and usable. So when you write labels for links, and labels is the terminology that's used to describe the text that becomes the link, right? So whatever text is used and becomes the hyperlink, that's considered a label. So when you're writing labels for links, it's important to remember what we call the 4 S's for improving findability, improvability, and accessibility. The first is be specific. The primary purpose of your label should be to communicate to a user what they're going to find on the other end of a click or a tap. And a vague or repetitive information is going to fail that purpose. We've seen a lot of uses of things like learn more. It's very popular, but it does fail this task of being specific. That text has poor information scent, and it's bad for accessibility. With a little effort, you can transform that filler copy into a descriptive label that helps users confidently predict what the next page will be. Even a little more information can be useful. So learn about our services instead of just learn more. Sincere. A link is a promise. Set up accurate expectations and then fulfill them. As an example, in one particular study, a user was on a travel site looking for a tour she wanted to book. She was on the page of the tour that she wanted to book and saw a link that said more info and book. So she clicked it. But then she was annoyed when she was taken to a pop-up with a contact form. That was not what she was expecting. That label could have been improved by being just a little more transparent about the next step in the process. Contact us to book, for example. So substantial. Eye tracking research, which is something that literally tracks how users in a study, how their eyes move across the screen. They show that users pay attention to salient items of a user interface. So links that are styled differently from static text stand out and they draw people's eyes to them. So as a consequence, links need to be able to stand on their own. They have to make sense without any other context. So things like taglines or descriptive text, right? An example from a university homepage. There was a text that said, restoring vision and hope. Well, what does that mean, right? Hope for what? vision for the future. The link actually took users to an article about a program that provides eye care to Syrian refugees. So being a little less clever but more straightforward, providing eye care to Syrian refugees makes that link far more substantial and fulfills these other goals of being specific and sincere as well. And be succinct, right? Get to the point as quickly as possible so that you can increase the likelihood that someone will find and use the link as they scan the page. Notice that this is last in the list. It's important, but it needs to be balanced with the other priorities. There's no maximum limit. Link text could be as long as it needs to be to achieve those other priorities, but no longer than that. Each word that you include in the link should support these goals. Now let's talk about files a little bit. If you must post a file, always use PDF, unless the source document needs to be a template. So if you're providing a template, a memorandum template, or a template for a PowerPoint, then certainly those original source files would make sense. But if it's a PowerPoint presentation like what I'm giving right now that I want to make available for download later on, I should convert that to PDF and post it that way. If you've ever clicked on a link that was to a Word document or a PowerPoint, you'll know that you have to then download the files, save it to your desktop, open it up in another application. I would have to say that unless I know exactly what I'm getting and that I know that I need it, 95% of the time, if I click on a link that makes me download something first, I'm just going to decide I don't need it. So whereas most users, their browsers are configured to at least allow a PDF to open up in their browser window. 508 compliance, accessibility, is not optional. And honestly, just the fact that you're posting it on the web isn't what makes the 508 compliance necessary. Any electronic files that we create are required to be 508 compliant. Whether they're posted on the web or stored on a network drive, 508 compliance is not optional. So it's important that you use the accessibility tools that come in some of those source documents. The Section 508 office that the agency has provides some training and some online documentation. If you're working in a Word document, it's better to run accessibility and make the Word document accessible first, then convert to PDF, run the accessibility checker within Adobe, and fix those things there. But I will tell you that making a file 508 compliant can be a lot of work, even if it's just a small number of pages. So we always recommend that if someone gives you a Word document or a PDF file to post, that you take a look at it and you say, does this need to stay in this format? Does this need to be something that people will print out and use in this print format? If not, seriously consider taking that content and converting it into pages that you place on the intranet. In most cases, a single PDF document can be easily converted into text on one or more basic pages. If you do, excuse me, if you do upload files, make sure that those files have document properties. So a title, author, subject, and keywords, that metadata, the information about the document, is also a requirement. And one of the reasons that it's so important is if you don't, when a file has no metadata, no document properties, if that file shows up in search results, it ends up with a text with a title that says no title, there's no description, and the only thing that's available is the link to the file. No title and a URL is not very useful for your users if they're looking for a specific type of content. And as I mentioned before, files are not really considered web or digital content. So keep that in mind as you work through these things and figure out how to best post your content. Files are not web content, they are files. And we'll take another minute to talk about PDFs specifically, because this is the largest file type that gets posted on the web. And the Nielsen Norman Group, which are world leaders in research-based user experience, they wrote an article over 20 years ago about why PDFs are not good for digital content or not a good digital experience. And what they published another article just within the last year, I believe, where they basically came back and said, yep, 20 years later, these are still unfit for human consumption is the terminology that they used. Because research that spans 20 years has proven repeatedly that PDFs are really problematic for online reading. Yet they're still prevalent and users continue to get lost in them. They're unpleasant to read and navigate, and they really do remain unfit for digital content display. Because PDFs are typically files that have converted from documents that were planned for print, or they were created in print-focused software platforms. And they have a jarring user experience because they look completely different from typical web pages. They take users out of a familiar context and into one that's often outdated and clunky. Even if your PDF looks slick and you think users are going to be able to navigate it with things like keyboard shortcuts like Command or Control F to find information, think again. Even the most polished PDFs look out of place in a web browser, and not all users know keyboard shortcuts. The Nielsen Group has repeatedly observed what they consider advanced users getting stuck in PDFs and failing to find information. And while the risk of crashing a user's browser or computer by serving up a PDF is definitely lower than in years past, PDFs can be excruciatingly slow to load, both on the desktop and on mobile devices. PDFs also tend to lack real substance compared to regular web pages. When you're building out a web page, you can visibly see how long it's getting and how far users will have to scroll to consume that content. Methods of structuring and formatting digital content, such as chunking, using bullets and subheadlines, and even anchors, right, or jump links, where people jump down to the page. Those things help users efficiently skim and scan sections that may contain the answers they seek in long-form copy. But in a PDF, those techniques aren't always used, and content creators tend to favor quantity of content over quality and formatting. And this often leads to overwhelmingly long PDFs. And because PDFs aren't web pages, they don't show standard navigation like a website would. And users often struggle to stay oriented with where they are and how to get back to where they were before. Especially if a PDF were to open in a new browser tab or window and a user didn't notice, they'll wonder why the browser's back button doesn't work and how to get back. Most PDF files also have no internal navigation. Their little mini information architecture is completely hidden, and people have no quick way of understanding the type of content that's available in the PDF or getting to the interesting bits without scrolling through everything that comes before them. And finally, PDFs have been sized for paper, not screens. PDF layouts are often optimized for a printed sheet of paper, which never aligns with the size and scale of a user's browser window. So hopefully I've convinced you to try to severely limit the use of PDFs when you're trying to create web content. Reserve PDFs for things like long reports or posting print versions of things that you're posting for transparency or because you expect users to download and print them. So let's talk a little bit about content types and why they matter. And this really is, while the specific content types that I'm going to go over are intranet focused, some of these same things will still apply on the public web. The idea of using the right type of content type for the information you're looking to publish will make sense regardless of which environment you're working on. So the two primary content types that you see across the intranet are landing pages and basic pages. But there are other content types as well. Things like articles, blog posts, events, staff member, and web form. There's even specialized content types that are available only to specialized user groups, such as mass mailers or employee profile. ORD and EPA both do photos of the week, and ORD has its weekly compass and faces of ORD. So why is it important to pick the right content type to post your content? Well, structured content allows the content management system to do things. And I've just provided a couple of examples of, in many cases, simply being able to collect a particular type of content and filter it out so that you're only displaying things based off of different criteria. So maybe all events that are filtered by the event host. If if you have an event and you create a basic page where you talk about that event, it's only available on that basic page. It doesn't show up on the agency calendar. It can't show up on a dynamic list of events that may be filtered by an event host or by a keyword phrase. Same thing goes for articles, right? If you've got news or announcement-based content, by generating that content as articles instead of basic pages, you have set yourself up to be able to provide collections of that content in different ways should you need to download. And just one more note about calendars, if you didn't know, calendar pages already have these pre-built, pre-filtered pages that look just like the calendar. So the agency calendar, for example, is just @/calendar, right? But if you add the program office or the regional after the calendar, it is already a pre-filtered view of events only by that host. So if I'm in region 1 and I'm creating events, not only can I can link to a pre-filtered version of the calendar, or I could choose to have a dynamic list of events that region 1 is the host of on my site. I wouldn't have any of those options if I was creating that content just inside a basic page. So landing pages, I mentioned, were one of the two primary types of content that you can create. A landing page is something that's going to introduce your office or program or topic to the users, right? It should give them enough information to figure out what content is available without overwhelming them. We want to avoid large blocks of text, right? But rather we want to summarize the collections of the content. Think of this as sort of maybe almost like a table of contents where you're showing all of the level 1 items, right? So as we look at the US Web Design System, which is the baseline for all of our design standards, their landing page template is what we use. So the first part of a landing page, right, is the hero. That's the big image, and it's got a hero block that you can use. You might choose to use a tagline, where a tagline focuses on maybe an overall approach that you're taking to your audience. And then the information on the right, directly to the right of that tagline explains the tagline a little bit more. And then you roll down into what we call a graphic list, which is comprised of 2 or more media blocks. This is where you are, again, summarizing a group of content that users would then be able to click into if they wanted more information. And then beyond that, there's additional components that you can place on a landing page, things like a section with a call to action, there's card components, there's lots of different ways that you can visually provide enough information to the user to help them understand what they're going to find on the other side of that click without overwhelming them. So speaking of clicks, right, there's this idea of this 3-click rule. It's been this sort of unofficial user experience rule that said no page should take more than 3 clicks or taps on a touchscreen to get to, or the idea that the most important information should never take more than 3 clicks to get to. And that rule assumed that users would become frustrated and give up on tasks that require more than 3 total clicks to be completed. Well, the biggest problem with this rule is that it has not been supported by data in any published study to date. In fact, there was a study done by a man named Joshua Porter that completely debunked it, and it showed that user drop-off does not increase when the task involves more than 3 clicks, nor does their satisfaction decrease if something takes more than 3 clicks. So click counting by itself is not really a meaningful metric for a couple of reasons. First, the number of clicks that it's needed to complete a task depend not only on the design, but also the complexity of the task. So an absolute number that's not applicable to all tasks is not really possible. And not all clicks are equal. Some result in long wait times, right? Others are instantaneous. Depends. Am I clicking to expand like an accordion, or am I clicking with something that reloads right there in the page versus loading a new page? The number of clicks it takes to do something rarely tells the whole story. So there are many aspects of the design that contribute to its usability, whether the task flow involves 2 clicks or 10. So it's important to remember, in the real world also, users make mistakes. They misunderstand things and they get confused along the way. So simply counting the number of steps in a process, it misses out on what users actually do. and the opportunities to provide them with a less frustrating experience. So, although limiting the amount of effort required to access key information or accomplish a task is important, the 3-click rule is really arbitrary. There's nothing inherent about 3 clicks as some sort of magical threshold before users get frustrated. And more important than focusing on the raw number of clicks to get to something is ensuring that your navigation is well organized with clear pathways, and that your content gets progressively more specific the deeper into the site structure your users advance. That's how site visitors always know where they currently are and how to get to their destination. So I put that after landing pages as just a way to say you don't need to put links to everything on your landing page. Also, basic pages, right? This is the meat of our content. This is where the specific information about your topic or theme that may have already been contextualized on your landing page exists, and it provides that detailed information. So if we look here at as an example of some basic pages, where all basic pages will always have the sidebar navigation. You can choose to lay out your page content with detailed text, and then there's a series of components that you can place on basic pages as well. And this is really where the meat of your content is. And when it comes to making determinations of what goes into the menu that comes with EPA at Work and ORD at Work through the web design system support 3 levels, right? So you will always be able to have 3 levels deep of menu links. So we encourage you that if you have a basic page, that you add it to your menu, right? Especially if it's a sub page of another page. Because if it's not in the menu, it can be a little disconcerting. Users don't really understand where they are in context to the rest of your web area and its content. So I've covered a lot of things today in about 40 minutes, 45 minutes. So I'd like to now go ahead and just see if we have any questions. I'm going to check the chat and see what we've got here. But if there's anybody who's on the call that wants to unmute and ask a question, please feel free to do so. Let's see. So there are some comments here about the PDFs, right? And I knew this is always a big one, because especially it's a big deal across government, not just EPA, right? There are times when we are required to publish them, and it just is what it is, right? And PDFs do have bookmarks, but you'd be surprised how many users don't even know about them, or know about the page option or the outline things that are there. I think it's important to remember that you should use those things when you know you have to have a PDF. But if something doesn't have to be a PDF to be published online, you should really reconsider how you choose to post that content, right? So yes, I will be making the recording available. And are you available to consult with teams? So the question from Kathleen, yes, absolutely. I will do my best to make myself available if users have questions about how they're choosing to structure their page content, if they're following, basic best practices that might be out there, or usability experiences for sure. As well as I would also recommend that that you work with, if it's on the intranet, that you work with your intranet council representative so that they are also in a position to provide you with some additional support. But you can always find me on Teams or shoot me a question. I'll be happy to answer those. I also wanted to let you know the last page in the slide here lists links to all of the things that I talked about, right? So when I talked about best practices or recommendations, it's not just because Jessica thinks so. It really is industry best practices and research-based recommendations from specifically, I really like the Nielsen Group. They are really fantastic. They do a lot of user studies and report back on how people consume content on the web, and really do provide a lot of really great information. So I'm actually going to go ahead and stop the recording now, so that if anybody does want to come ask a question, they can do so off the recording.